Welcome live to Facebook streaming live. Welcome to the pre-show of the show.
That's right.
Which is not a show yet. So we say so. Coming up soon.
No show till we say so.
Right.
That's a thing, right?
I'm going to share this to my timeline, as I do.
Settiers are... Oh, I'm so much taller than you in this chair. That's all I can do. Just be a little shorter.
It's a small table.
Well, also I think I sit further forward than he does.
All right, let's go to...
Welcome, guys.
Hey, we're there.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for Post-Orthodoxy. We've had a lot of fun preparing this part 2 of drug dogmas for you. That was Dark's term that he coined this morning, drug dogmas. And we're going to continue to go through things that we have learned, things that occurred to us since our radio show last week, and stuff that people have brought up for us to think about since our radio show last week. We got a lot of notes, and my goals, at least, I want to talk about why is it an important conversation to legalize what you do with your body as it pertains to substances you might consume. Why is that important? Why should we have that conversation? I want to talk about practical steps towards legalization and decriminalization. What have other countries done that worked? Sometimes it's really hard to have a hypothetical conversation if you don't have plausible ways of making it work.
How does it look? You have to paint the picture so people know what it looks like.
Right.
It has to be more than a concept.
It's not just let's be free and do all the drugs. Like there are steps that can be taken to make this a responsible movement towards civilian freedom of your own body. What are some current studies being done on chemicals that people think of as bad or illegal?
People. Who are those people?
Most of the citizens of the U.S. and a large portion of the planet at this point. The War on Drugs campaign was a very, very successful and long-standing brainwashing campaign.
That's a strong term, brainwashing.
Nobody really likes to think of themselves as brainwashed, but if you don't acknowledge that there are people out there trying to get you to think certain things, then you can never defend yourself against people trying to make you think certain things. And we have all been brainwashed by the U.S. war on drugs, except for those of you that always knew it was a hoax and always knew it was a racist lie.
Right.
I have had to deal with my own brainwashing based on the lies that I was taught by my parents, who learned them during the war on drugs campaign. Why do certain communities resist harm reduction practices?
What do you mean by certain communities?
Some of our neighbors.
Neighbors?
We're all neighbors with each other on the planet. And some of our neighbors don't think people should have access to clean needles or someone to help them safely inject the drugs they're using.
Or test kits for drugs that are illegal.
Or, what is it, methadone?
Methadone, which helps.
Which is a overdose canceling drug. And people are like...
No, is that what it is?
Isn't that what it is?
Methadone is what people who are recovering from heroin addiction, this is what they do instead of heroin to help them to come down from being addicted to heroin. So you want to quit heroin, so methadone is it's like a halfway house between doing heroin and not doing either.
Naloxone.
Yes.
Is an overdose canceling drug. This is very similar to our completely ineffective and often false sex education in the U.S. We say we shouldn't just make sure all kids have condoms because of this mentality that you just shouldn't be having sex until you're married. And we say people shouldn't have access to naloxone, which cancels a potentially fatal overdose, because you just shouldn't be taking these chemicals. So that's a conversation that we have to have.
Okay. Certain communities.
I didn't write the word certain. It just came up in my brain when I said it. I don't mean certain communities. I just mean various people.
Various folks.
Lots of our neighbors in the U.S.
Right.
think that harm reduction policies will cause people to do more drugs, and that would be bad. It's not that we The goal should be, how do we help people be safe? And instead the goal is, how do we keep people from doing things they're not supposed to do?
And not supposed to do means basically that people who are subject to a certain amount of propaganda over what is good and bad.
Right. Anywhere from 25 to 75% of the US does think that certain things you might want to do with your body should be a crime, such as masturbation.
So I think another way to talk about certain people that think drugs are bad, I think maybe like a more accurate term might be bastards. In the sense that, bastard is somebody who doesn't know who their father is or know who their mother is, right?
Oh.
And so I feel like folks that don't really know who their mother or father are, like mother being your environment that fosters you.
You're going way out here with this.
I am.
I like it. I like it. Take it out and then bring it back in for us.
Mother and father, environment and culture. I mean, we live in an environment and a culture. And when you say, I want to make certain natural elements of the planet, mushrooms, marijuana, the stuff that
opium,
LSD, all those things. When you want to make those things illegal,
a crime,
you don't understand that your culture was built on them, directly or indirectly. The criminalizing of natural substances was never about our safety. It was about control.
We do think that the war on drugs is about civilian safety.
It's not about our safety.
It is not about civilian safety.
So for people who have been subjected to drug war propaganda for decades now,
and their parents and their grandparents,
it's just a matter of course drugs are bad. They just hammered that so many times that people believe drugs are bad. Drugs is a very broad term. Bad is a binary that does not fully cover.
Bad and good do not actually exist in the natural world. Humans created bad and good. Things can be healthy or unhealthy, fun or scary, diverse or bigoted, but they can't be bad or good in real life, in the natural realm. It is not bad or good that it rains. You might find it to be frustrating that it's raining because you just washed your car. You might find it to be relieving that it's raining because your crops are dying. But it is actually not morally bad or good that it rains, just like caffeine is not morally bad or good.
Saying drugs are bad is lazy.
Yes.
And not conducive to education or understanding of the world around you. So I think it might be good to start. I know you've done a lot of research for this program.
So have you.
I've done a lot of research. I think it might be good to start off with some qualification of some terms that I outlined.
So many terms. We're also going to have to talk about the concept of addiction.
Use and abuse.
And our goal in this show, we're not going to be talking about our personal experiences with chemicals. We're talking about the policies and the laws and the brainwashing or mindsets surrounding things that you might do with your body. Stop, Billy. You have to stop licking. She's just laying here licking the floor. And we're going to be talking about ways that we can shift the way we think that would be healthier and with more of a tendency towards that good old American goal of freedom.
Freedom. Okay. Yeah. I can start with some things that I pulled out. When people hear the term psychedelic, it has connotations.
Yeah. Psychedelic, man.
There were a lot of research into psychedelics before drug prohibition of the 1970s. There was research by in the realm of psychotherapy. There was research in the realm of spirituality and religious. The mainstream religions were actually finding out about LSD, doing research, seeing if it might be a spiritual aid. This is before the hysteria around and the propaganda around these substances reached a fever pitch. The term psychedelic, the roots of the word psyche and delic basically mean to manifest the mind.
Psyche, mind, delic,
to manifest.
Indelible.
Right.
Yeah.
So psychedelic is a term that got used for years, but now in the more academic avenues of exploration of these substances and what they mean to individuals and to the collective, the word has changed to entheogenic. So I'll define psychedelic. The dictionary definition right now, the first thing that comes up on Google
For psychedelic
is it's an adjective relating to or denoting drugs, especially LSD, that produce hallucinations and apparent expansion of consciousness.
Apparent.
So,
I already take a little bit of offense to the word apparent expansion of consequences.
So the term hallucination is why a lot of folks are no longer using the term psychedelic when talking about this in a serious manner. A hallucination, the technical definition of hallucination is an experience involving the apparent perception of something not present.
You might think you perceive it, but you're really not.
It's not there, you perceive it's there. That is what a hallucination is. People did not like the term hallucination being used with the psychedelic experience or the entheogenic experience because there's another model that says just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. There's 70% of Americans believe are God, but have experiences of God. You could call that a hallucination according to this definition.
Well,
you can call that a psychedelic experience according to this.
The experience of God or angels.
Right.
Something that is not widely perceived, but that you perceive. I pray, I feel the presence of God.
It may not be a shared experience. You may not be able to turn to your partner and say, see this God I was just talking to over here? Probably not going to happen so much.
But if you say, I was praying and talking to God, many people will
accept
that.
Right. So the idea of a hallucination, of something not being there, that's where some issues came up. The new term to talk about these chemical substances, entheogen or entheogenic. Entheogen is a noun. It's a chemical substance, typically of plant origin, that is ingested to produce a non-ordinary state of consciousness for religious or spiritual purposes.
Non-ordinary state of consciousness.
Not a hallucinatory state of consciousness.
Right. It's not fake. It's just not the same thing everybody else is usually having.
We may not have models to explain what that experience is in definite scientific terms, but they are experiences that people have that changes lives, and it's outside of the ordinary realm of experience or way of defining these events.
I think it's important here sometimes for perspective. You know, we go down the rabbit hole of things that we don't talk about very much as a culture anymore. If you're like, okay, but hallucinations are hallucinations, you know, like God is real, but hallucinations are fake. What is colorblind? I think it's important to step outside of the conversation about drugs and talk about non-ordinary experiences that our neighbors are having. There are people who cannot see orange the same way you see orange. And if you were to ask them what color this apple was, they would give you what you would think of as a wrong answer. And and so we think of colorblind people as being broken.
Or wrong.
And
their assessment of the color.
And yet, if we put an island together, a whole town of colorblind people, they would often agree with each other on the colors of things and would not be wrong because their experience would now be the ordinary experience.
Sanity is a majority accepted reality.
Yes, and reality is what you perceive it to be.
If it's agreed upon by the majority.
The agreed upon. But if
it's your reality, you could be crazy according to the consensus.
If you're perceiving a reality such as the flowers in my garden turn into fairies when I sing to them.
Or machine elves on DMT.
If you're perceiving that reality, but a bunch of other people aren't, our society has the habit of calling you crazy.
Crazy. So we're dealing with the term psychedelic and the term entheogen or entheogenic as the new term. I'd also like to introduce this idea that I started talking about in the first episode of this drug series, cognitive liberty. So when you Google cognitive liberty, the first thing that comes up is a Wikipedia definition of the term. Cognitive liberty, or the, quote, right to mental self-determination.
And so this is us talking about why should what you do with your body be legal.
Well, I want to talk about right now. There's a lot of discussion about liberty and freedom. Some people are like, "You told me to stay in my house. I don't want to. I'm not free anymore."
Mm-hmm.
There are other people that don't see freedoms as necessarily, what's the word, literal things. Freedom. There's a much more abstract interpretation of what freedom is, and that's where I feel the term cognitive liberty comes in, the ability to self-determine mentally.
I grew up reading about Christian martyrs who were imprisoned for decades of their life and claimed to be freer than their captors.
Right.
Because they had achieved a mental state in their relationship and their understanding of God that they were able to be in this prison cell most of their life but know that they were free.
But under the DSM-5, psychopharmaceutical manual of conditions and such.
Right, like bipolar.
They would be diagnosed as bipolar or delusional or schizophrenic. Right. So cognitive liberty, I'm interested in this idea. The definition from Wikipedia is the freedom of an individual to control his or her own mental processes, cognition, and consciousness. It has been argued to be both an extension of and the principle underlying the right to freedom of thought.
Can you read that one again?
Yes. Cognitive liberty, or the right to mental self-determination, is the freedom of an individual to control his or her own mental processes, cognition, and consciousness. It's been argued to be both an extension of and the principles underlying the right to freedom of thought. That's from Wikipedia. Some folks championed this idea pretty heavily. In 1999, there was an organization called the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics, CCIE, which you can find them, I think it's .org. You can find them online. The Cognitive Liberty and Ethics, Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics, is dedicated to protecting and advancing freedom of thought in the modern world of accelerating neurotechnologies. Our paramount concern is to foster the unlimited potential of the human mind and to protect freedom of thought. The CCIE is a network of scholars elaborating the law, policy, and ethics of freedom of thought.
CCLE.
CCLE, sorry, yes. Our mission is to develop public policies that will preserve and enhance freedom of thought into the 21st century. So they started this at the beginning of the century. We monitor developments in neurotechnology, psychopharmacology, cognitive sciences, and the law to identify and offer guidance concerning those developments with the potential to significantly impact freedom of thought. So that is their mission. They sort of petered off for a while due to lack of funding, but they've renewed their effort for 2020. And so they're back online, they're renewing, they're going back over their old. They have their sort of manifesto online, which I've taken some excerpts of why they are on the mission that they're on, and I can get into some of that right now if we want. We'll start with, let's see, here's another section. It says psychedelics have gone from underground to mainstream, and marijuana is now legal in the majority of states. Artificial intelligence, CRISPR, I'm not sure what that is, I have to look it up, and various neurotechnologies have likewise gone from niche labs to multi-million-dollar markets. Psychoinformatics, which
I think CRISPR is designing your DNA.
Designing your DNA, okay.
I think.
Okay.
What is CRISPR and how is it used? CRISPR is a technology that can be used to edit genes.
Ah, okay. So this is not just about chemicals, this is about technology and neurochemicals and law and culture. So I'm going to read this again. First, I'm going to define what psychoinformatics is, which is a new thing, apparently. It's not in the dictionary yet. Psychoinformatics is defined as an emerging discipline that uses tools and techniques from the computer and information sciences to improve the acquisition, organization, and the synthesis of psychological data.
Okay.
So to read that paragraph above, psychedelics have gone from underground to mainstream, and marijuana is now legal in a majority of the states. Artificial intelligence, CRISPR, which would be gene editing, I guess, and various neurotechnologies have likewise gone from niche labs to multi-million-dollar markets. Psychoinformatics and surveillance capitalism have gone from science fiction to everyday reality. They have a 4-part series that they've republished on their
The Center
page.
for Cognitive Liberty.
Yes, and ethics. They have a 4-part series penned by Richard Glenn Bohr and published in the Journal of Cognitive Liberties from 1999 to 2003.
Oh, that's a long journal.
They introduced the term cognitive liberty in that back
Okay.
in 1999. And then they outlined why they believed it was relevant to the turn of this millennium and sketched an initial version for its scope. So
Okay.
this is first part. I'm just going to read some excerpts from the first part of this 4-part series. This excerpt is called A Very Brief History of U.S. Government and Mind Control. So this is an excerpt.
This is why this is our first subject for the day. This is why
Yes.
we need to talk about what you put in your body should not be a crime, because of the history of how it became a crime what you put into your body.
So I'm going to read a little bit.
Okay.
We've got a few paragraphs here, and I think it's salient if you have ever read the book or at least are familiar with the book 1984. It's talking about that book and putting what they're talking about into context. In the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, the U.S. government illegally and unethically drugged unwitting U.S. citizens with psychoactive substances, including LSD, as a part of projects Bluebird, Artichoke, and MK Ultra, all in an attempt to develop techniques of mind control. Richard Helms, the chief planner of MK Ultra, wrote in a planning memorandum that the program was designed in part to, and I quote, investigate the development of chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, non-ordinary, the specific nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, and implanting suggestions and other forms of mental control. While the MK Ultra program began with tests in the laboratory on willing volunteers, the CIA quickly saw the need to expand the testing and determine what the effects of the drugs such as LSD would be on unsuspecting people. Thus, in 1953, the CIA...
in dosing people without their knowledge.
Correct. So in 1953, the CIA moved its mind control program into the streets of America and began the covert testing of materials on unwitting U.S. citizens.
Which is documented historical U.S. fact.
The CIA started dosing people on LSD to see what would happen to them. To see how some guy at a bar suddenly is on an acid trip.
How would you behave when you don't know that's what's happening to you?
So they did some testing. They also, the lab testing that they talked about, some of you may have heard of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or might have heard of the author of the book that the movie was based on, Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey was an early test subject in LSD testing at Stanford in California in the early days of this testing. He was being tested, LSD was being tested on him. He became aware through LSD what this chemical was. He knew more about what it was through his experience than the people who were doing the experiments on him.
Because they hadn't taken the chemical.
They hadn't taken it.
They were trying to figure out what it did just by observing someone else's experience with LSD.
So as LSD started to move into when the push and the propaganda to make it illegal started to go forward, it had already flooded the West Coast and various other cities around the world. And the Cultural Revolution and the anti-war movement was fueled by the drug that was unleashed by the CIA. This was not accidental. The CIA said, let's try this. Some people tried it and they said, the CIA is not a good source for this. We need to find somebody else. The chemists did the research, found the things.
They figured out how to create it.
And next thing you know, we have the Grateful Dead.
Right. But acid, I just found out today through our research, acid was not invented by the CIA in the 60s.
It was invented in the 40s by Albert Hoffman. He was looking for a migraine cure.
But he was synthesizing something based on an ancient practice of using marigold seeds for the same effect.
It was actually not marigold seeds. It was, what's the violet flowers that grow on the vine? I remember that.
Morning glories?
Morning glory seeds.
My mom loves morning glories.
Morning glory seeds. I thought the original distillation came from a mold called ergot mold, which is a rye mold. When people started looking into rye mold, they discovered that this is probably what a lot of very mysterious events in medieval history came from.
Right.
Mass hysterias.
Everybody dancing in the streets.
There was a
prophets.
A story about an entire town that had a dancing madness and they couldn't stop dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And it might have been some mold in the rye grain that was distributed and people ate it, and then there was a collective shift.
Mm-hmm.
And some people were dancing and didn't want to. It was very uncomfortable for a number of folks, I understand. Anyway, that's a little sidebar.
Okay.
This essay, it's quoting the gentleman from the CIA that I was just quoting. In subsequent installments of this essay, we will see how the U.S. government continues to promulgate certain policies that, while cloaked in public health, quote unquote, or public safety, quote unquote, justifications, amount to an impermissible government action aimed at policing thought and interfering with the mental processes of citizens. So if you're concerned about freedom, this might be something you want to listen to. Further down in this essay, in George Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984, the Oceania government diligently worked to establish Newspeak, a carefully crafted language designed by the government for the purpose of making unapproved, quote, modes of thought impossible.
Unapproved modes of thought.
Right. Prior to Newspeak, the people of Oceania communicated with Oldspeak, an autonomous natural language capable of expressing nuanced emotions and multiple points of view. By controlling language through the imposition of Newspeak, or by eliminating undesirable words, the government of Oceania was able to control and in some cases completely extinguish certain thoughts. As a character in 1984 explained to Winston Smith, "Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller." Unquote. Those people raised with Newspeak, having never known the wider range of Oldspeak, might fail to notice, indeed, might be unable to even perceive, that the government was limiting consciousness. In 1970, just 4 years after the Catholic Church finally abandoned the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which was
abandoned or embodied, embraced.
They finally abandoned it.
Okay, so they've had a list of banned books.
Since the 1400s.
The Catholic Church had a mega list of banned books, and they were like, "We're not censoring what you read anymore."
So they said, "We're not censoring what you read anymore." So just 4 years after that, the United States government produced its own index of forbidden thought catalysts, which I think is an interesting term. The federal
forbidden thought catalysts.
Yes.
That just freaks me out. Like, you want to talk about freedom? Like, I should be free to think about whatever I want to think about.
I should be able to catalyze my thoughts in non-ordinary ways.
Even I cannot. My freedom to swing my fist ends at your face. I cannot be free to cause harm to someone else or to infringe someone else's rights. But I should be free to think whatever thoughts I want to think.
I agree. So the United States government produced its own index of forbidden thought catalysts, the Federal Schedule of Controlled Substances. This is our modern drug policy. Included on the initial list of Schedule 1 substances were 17 substances denoted as, quote, hallucinogens, and declared to have, quote, a high potential for abuse, and, quote, no currently accepted medical use in the USA, and a, quote, a lack of accepted safety. even under medical supervision.
So it's in order to be Schedule 1, a substance must be dangerous and hard to administer even for medical professionals, have no verifiable benefits,
Medical use.
nothing beneficial about this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's highly addictive. As in, you can't get off it if you want to.
That was the criterion.
For Schedule 1 drugs.
So among the list of outlawed, quote, hallucinogens were psilocybin and psilocin. These are the active principles of psilocybe mushrooms. Dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, the active principle in ayahuasca and many visionary snuffs. Ibogaine, mescaline, peyote, and LSD. The experience elicited by these substances in their chemical or natural plant forms is the par excellence of old speak, a cognitive modality dating from prehistory. Just as new speak depended in part upon time eradicating knowledge of old speak, today's war on entheogens is sustainable, in part because the current generation of young adults, now this is written in 1999, the current generation of young adults,
20 years ago,
21 to 30, which would be 30, 40 and younger now.
Now it's people 40 to 60.
Right. 40 and younger. Like everybody under 40, basically.
Now it's everybody under 50.
Okay.
Because if they were 21...
Right, 20 years ago, everybody under 50.
Yeah, everybody under 50.
Today's war on entheogens is sustainable in part because the current generation of young adults, everybody under 50, have never known a time when most entheogens were not illicit.
They've never known a time when you could just do what you wanted to do to your body without worrying about the cops.
Those who have never experienced the mental states that are now prohibited do not realize what the laws are denying them. It's as if nothing is being taken away, at least nothing noticeable, nothing that is missed. As pointed out by the authors of a law review article on how mandatory schooling raises issues of mass consciousness control, quote, the more the government regulates formation of beliefs so as to interfere with personal consciousness, the fewer people can conceive dissenting ideas or perceive contradictions between self-interest and government-sustained ideological orthodoxy. That's a mouthful.
If you don't know what you're missing, you don't know what you're missing.
Right.
And you don't know why it's a problem that you don't have the freedom to experience those things.
So people used to walk around naked and nobody cared. And then people started putting on clothes and enforcing clothes. And now if you see somebody naked, it's shocking. The natural state is shocking.
I saw an amazing short film a few years ago about the opening scene is this young man, in his 20s or 30s. He's gardening outside and he's naked and he's looking around suspiciously, and then he goes into his house and shuts the door and goes out to his room and closes all the curtains and goes into a wood panel under the floor under his bed and pulls out a pair of pants, and he pulls the pants onto his body and buttons them up and looks at himself in the mirror, and then his mom walks in on him and she's shocked. It's a silent film. It's like so it's all dramatic gestures, but it's basically this film of how our perceptions of what is correct or normal are just because everybody thinks those things are correct or normal, not because those things are objectively correct or normal. He gets lynched by the town of naked people for wanting to wear pants.
Right. So we have this going on currently with our drug policy. We've made everybody under 50 who's been living in a world
where it's always been illegal.
It's really hard to conceive of that they didn't have their rights taken away. They were born not having those rights.
Right.
So the idea of cognitive liberty is tied to these chemicals through this organization and through my assessment of what's going on. If you don't have the freedom to have non-ordinary states of consciousness, I think sometimes you use different lenses when you're shooting. Sometimes you want to zoom in on something. Sometimes you want to get a wider frame than you can even get with your own eyeball. You change lenses to perceive things differently, to create different maps of reality.
Right. Right.
So some of these substances can be useful for this.
The map is not the territory. Sometimes you need a map of the rivers. Sometimes you need a map of just the little neighborhood that you're in.
Sometimes you need a map of hydrology. Sometimes you need a map of the topography. Sometimes you need a meteorological map to figure out what you're doing in that zone.
Yeah.
So these substances have been used for thousands and thousands of years in various cultures throughout the world. Also, alcohol has been used to lesser degrees of success in terms of creating wise and vibrant cultures.
Yeah, alcohol doesn't tend to.
So that is one organization that I would highly recommend people to explore if they are interested in this notion of cognitive liberty. If you're interested in freedom and liberty, this is the forefront of that battle. I think it precedes all the other forms of liberty. You have to have a free mind before you can ever be free physically. So before you can be
physically free and not have a free mind. That's
we're seeing that happen all over the country right now.
Right. You to be free to think for yourself. We think of you think of brainwashing. Brainwashing is enforcing information so that somebody comes to doubt themselves and to think that that information is the correct thing. Teaching is objectively sharing facts without any moral judgment about those facts and instilling the ability to to have creative thinking. Critical thinking. The ability to have critical thinking. If you are teaching somebody something, you're like, here are the facts, and here's how you can think about those facts with your own mind.
So I started with the cognitive liberty folks.
Mm-hmm.
That sets the premise for the next stage of the next main website that I was looking into today that I also want to put a link to if you're interested in this subject matter. There's an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS. Founded in 1986, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies is a 501c3 nonprofit research and educational organization that develops medical, legal, and cultural contexts for people to benefit from the careful uses of psychedelics and marijuana. This is the organization. They are making sure, because a drug such as MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, or mushrooms, these have been shown to be very useful in the treatment of PTSD of our returning war veterans, among other people. We can't test those substances in the United States. We know that these things have been useful because they test them in Sweden, and they test them in Mexico. They test them in various other countries that see the benefits of this kind of testing. So we live in a globe now. We don't live in a country. We live on we're aware we live on a planet. So the prohibition on the research into these substances is being lifted slowly, country by country. So now people are able to look into these things. What I found really interesting and ironic, and I will read through some of the latest news on substances like MDMA, LSD, ibogaine, is that these substances are on the Schedule 1 list for our drug policy. These substances, the research that they're doing, well, I'll just start one by one, and then we'll see if we can find the common thread.
And again, Schedule 1 drugs, substances, or chemicals, which I pulled up definitions for all. What is a drug? What is a substance? What is a medicine? These all have different terms. Schedule 1 drug, substances, or chemicals, things you ingest, are defined as drugs with no current medical use and a high potential for abuse, and they cannot be administered safely even by professionals.
Right. So,
which is why you're supposedly not supposed to test them, because they can't be administered safely.
On the current news section of the MAPS website, under MDMA, they say MAPS is undertaking a roughly $26.9 million plan. I'm glad they're being funded.
Yeah.
To make MDMA-assisted psychotherapy into a Food and Drug Administration approved prescription treatment by 2020.
That's awesome.
For-profit pharmaceutical companies are not interested in developing MDMA into a medicine because the patent of MDMA has expired. In other words, you don't have to have, often drugs are patented, and whoever holds the patent has the sole
can make the money
profiteer
off
of the thing. It's common. It's knowledge for the folks.
The patent has expired and nobody else can take
Nobody
the
can
patent
own it.
back.
Right.
Okay, I didn't know that patents could expire. So basically, nobody can just say, I make money off of this because I invented it.
So for-profit pharmaceutical companies don't seem to be interested in MDMA. The idea of using MDMA to assist psychotherapy of any kind for any specific clinical indication has long been in the public domain. It's illegal, but if you can do the research, you could find out that it shouldn't be illegal because it does have uses.
Right.
MAPS,
it doesn't fit the definition of a Schedule I drug.
Right. MAPS is recruiting subjects for clinical trials. If you would like to be included.
If only I had trauma. Like, I don't have...
You have religious trauma, that's for sure.
I have religious family...
You got plenty of... You're fine. You could totally be...
Right.
You don't have to be a Vietnam vet to have trauma. We know this.
Right.
Right?
People can have PTSD who are not soldiers.
In MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, MDMA is only administered a few times, unlike most medications for mental illnesses, which are often taken daily for years and sometimes forever. So this is a drug that is being used to treat PTSD and trauma that is a limited use therapy that then ideally frees you from the trauma rather than treating the symptoms of the trauma for the rest of your life.
Our healthcare in the U.S. is largely symptom relief.
Right. So let's go into LSD. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, is a semi-synthetic compound first developed in 1938 by Dr. Albert Hofmann at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company in Basel, Switzerland. After Dr. Hofmann first discovered its effects in 1943, I believe he was looking for a migraine cure, LSD quickly became recognized for its possible therapeutic effects. LSD also played a significant role in the discovery of the serotonin neurotransmitter system.
And serotonin is your happy chemicals, right?
That's right. So
people with depression, whether it's chronic or acute depression, have their body doesn't have enough of the ability to accept happy chemicals. Right?
Correct.
People with depression are serotonin depleted.
There was a period of time in Los Angeles when it was very trendy in LA to do LSD therapy with your therapist. It wasn't illegal. So one of the most famous that we like to go to, I'm going to find a quote. Cary Grant did over 100 LSD trips.
Mm-hmm. I'm sharing.
Says it changed his life.
While you look for that quote, I'm sharing some resources that Kevin Olson has been sharing in the feed of books and shows that he's watched about chemical experiments in the U.S. so far. David Carradine, Carradine, On the Road is his biography. And he had an experience with peyote in that book.
Sure.
John Newland, in an episode of One Step Beyond, had an experience on mushrooms. Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World talks about a hypothetical or invented chemical called soma, which the government uses to control the masses. And Aldous Huxley's book Doors of Perception talks a lot about acid or LSD. And then he also mentioned, in conjunction with your something people can Google to look up how the government uses chemicals to experiment on civilians, is MK Ultra.
MK Ultra, yes. Project Bluebird.
Kevin also mentioned the U.S. Tuskegee experiments.
Yes.
As another time that the government used chemicals to experiment on civilians for the government's benefit. Right. And what Dark and I are talking about today is that civilians should have the right to experiment with chemicals for our benefits.
For our benefit. So, Cary Grant, famous acid head. There's a couple of quotes from him. He said, "I took LSD with the hope that would make me feel better about myself. I wanted to get rid of myself of all my hypocrisies. And he also said there's a great misconception about LSD and a great deal to explain. I used it about 100 times before it became illegal. He attributes it to saving his life.
Wow.
People used it. There were people. They did trials to try to treat alcoholism with LSD, and there are case studies of people who were chronic alcoholics who took one LSD trip, never drank again, never took acid again, had a transformative experience. So those studies were in place whenever LSD was scheduled one. So that was a lie. It was a lie to schedule it. It was a lie to say it had no
There were
positive.
lots and lots of documented results by people in a variety of fields that LSD is not addictive, it is not impossible to administer safely, and it does have beneficial uses. And yet, because most of the civilians didn't know about acid yet, we didn't have the internet, they weren't talking about it on television or the radio, the government was able to brainwash the US citizens into thinking that acid is addictive, not beneficial, and cannot be administered safely, so we can't study it.
I think it's pretty safe to say if when I say LSD and you associate negative, terrible things, you have been brainwashed.
Unfortunately. And you don't have to feel badly about yourself because of that.
People, you can resist it and say you're not.
I don't want to be brainwashed.
But you have been. So I'm going to go to another drug that a lot of people haven't heard about.
We don't have to be ashamed.
No.
Like, I know that I was brainwashed. I was taught that the earth was invented by God and the universe and everything in it 6,000 years ago, within 1 week, all at once. Humans, dinosaurs, and giant dragonflies all coexisting all at once, fully evolved humans. And it's been really hard for me to listen to any other scientific evidence outside of the scientific evidence that was used to teach me that God created the universe and everything in it all at once, fully evolved 6,000 years ago. That's brainwashing.
Yes.
I am not free to think my own thoughts and have my own opinions about creationism versus evolutionism without having moral judgments about which one is probably right.
Mm-hmm.
That's brainwashing.
So they're doing research on LSD right now, and I think it was the Swiss are doing research on it. And they're finding that they've done a small case study, 12 people, no negative effects, help them with anxiety, help them with trauma. So we're going to move on to a fun drug that often people don't know. I like to introduce. It's called Ibogaine.
Ibogaine?
Ibogaine.
I never heard of that.
Ibogaine or Ibogaine.
Sounds like Ipecac.
Is a psychoactive alkaloid naturally occurring in the West African shrub Iboga. While ibogaine is a mild stimulant in small doses, in larger doses it induces a profound psychedelic state. Historically, it has been used in healing ceremonies and initiations by members of the Bwiti religion in various parts of West Africa. People with problem substance use have found that larger doses of ibogaine can significantly reduce withdrawal from opiates and temporarily eliminate substance-related cravings.
Oh.
So we're going to do one more. I'm going to go to ayahuasca, and then I'm at the end of this list. This is again from the MAPS website. We recently completed the first North American observational study of the safety and long-term effectiveness of ayahuasca, a treatment for addiction and dependence. The paper describing the results of the study was published in June 2013 in Current Drug Abuse Reviews. Ayahuasca is legal in many countries in South America. The United States Supreme Court has unanimously ruled in favor of the legal religious use of ayahuasca.
So they can't say you're not allowed to do ayahuasca because it is a religious practice, and freedom of religion is one of the biggest tenets of the U.S.
Same thing with peyote. And the U.S. Center of Appeals Court for the Ninth Circuit has affirmed the Santo Daime Church's freedom to use ayahuasca for religious purposes. However, ayahuasca's principally active ingredient, DMT, remains a Schedule I controlled substance. So if you're in the church and you're using it in a religious way, you can do a DMT heavy substance, ayahuasca. The difference between DMT and ayahuasca, DMT is a naturally occurring neurochemical that is released when you dream. and is released when you die. And
DMT is in our bodies.
It's a naturally occurring. DMT is all through the environment. Sleeping grass that opens and closes, that's DMT. Willow bark has DMT in it. It's a naturally occurring neurochemical as well. We have it within our cells. If it is released while you're awake and conscious, or if it's ingested when you're awake or conscious, it's broken down by the body within about 15 minutes. It doesn't last more than about 15 minutes. It is also ayahuasca is that substance with an MAO inhibitor, which basically keeps the body from breaking it down for a longer period of time. So instead of a 15-minute experience, you're having an hour, 2-hour long experience.
Okay.
So it lasts longer in the body. This is a substance that is not something you do and walk to the park necessarily. I have done it in a religious setting, in a ceremonial setting.
Ayahuasca?
It's one of those things that people have been practicing it as a religious substance in their healing and exploratory rituals for thousands of years.
A particular experience with a particular goal.
Right, and that is a guided practice, like psychotherapy. So it predates psychotherapy.
I think one of the misconceptions a lot of people have is like, why should we be talking about legalizing drugs? It's just for party animals.
Just for party animals.
And there are like thousands of years of human history.
Yeah.
Humans have sought out mind-altering substances to enable spiritual experiences, to get a new perspective on a difficult event. Ayahuasca is definitely, from what you've told me and from what I've heard from other people who have taken ayahuasca journeys, definitely not something that you take to go dancing and relax with friends. There are chemicals...
Unless you want to throw up on them.
Right.
Yeah.
There are chemicals that you can take to go dancing and relaxing with friends that you can also take to have a quiet meditation with yourself and work through some trauma about your family. You can do that with certain things depending on what your intention is when you take the chemical. But ayahuasca, it seems, is most definitely for working through difficult stuff in your mind or your past. It brings up your demons, you purge your demons, and you come away with a broader sense of self.
Quote unquote.
You know, like that's like almost everybody barfs on ayahuasca.
Yes.
And one of the things I was reading on this, I think I accidentally closed the tab. No, the zendoproject.org. One of their main tenets.
What is the Zendo Project?
The Zendo Project is...
Which I found on the MAPS website.
Supportive and specialized care. It's harm reduction education for people who are seeking mind-altering substances and for people who want to be empowered to help other people take mind-altering substances in a safe and healthy and fun way.
Perhaps cognitive liberty reasons.
Yeah, and also you can get training so that you can go to music festivals and be what they call a trip sitter, which is somebody that understands if you're on MDMA, I need to keep you from drinking alcohol. If you're on acid, there's going to be a point a couple hours in where you're probably going to feel like laying down, and I need to make sure that you have a safe space to lay down. You know, and so you learn about the different chemicals, and so you understand harm reduction. You know, like if a girl is on MDMA at a music festival, don't let her go off with strange men alone, because MDMA like super relaxes you to a point that can be dangerous if it's combined with other chemicals.
Sure.
The Zendo Project reduces the number of psychiatric hospitalizations and arrests, creates an environment where volunteers can work alongside one another to improve harm reduction skills, and demonstrates that safe, productive psychedelic experiences are possible without the need for law enforcement-based prohibitionist policies. And one of their tenets that I really love, that I was thinking about when you were talking about ayahuasca, as opposed to like ecstasy or something that you could use for...
At a rave.
You could use it at a party to have a better time than you were having before, is difficult is not bad. Zendoproject.org. Difficult is not bad. Challenging experiences can wind up being our most valuable experiences and may lead us to learning and growth. Consider that you might be having a challenging experience for a reason. Suggest that the person having the challenging experience approaches their fear and the difficult aspects of that challenge with curiosity and openness.
Right.
We've been trained in a country where you're just supposed to do hard things and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that if anything is challenging, it's just bad. We've been trained to use the words hard and bad interchangeably, challenging and bad, difficult and bad.
Mm-hmm.
When you're not constantly being exhausted by being forced to do things that are challenging for you that you don't care about, such as maybe working a job where you're treated like crap by your boss for 20 years because you're supporting your kids, then you have extra energy to engage in challenging activities and experiences that would be beneficial for you. A challenging activity is weightlifting. Another challenging activity is rock climbing. Another challenging activity is learning how to play chess.
Going to school.
Just because things are difficult does not mean they're bad.
Right. So that's the research that I did. I wanted to sort of cover the bases in terms of some definition of terms to show that that whole list that I read of current research going on, we can't do it in the United States for the most of it because of prohibition, the drug prohibition.
Right.
But research is going on, and a lot of the research is using these substances that are on our Schedule 1 list to help people get off of drug abuse.
That are
To
not
end drug abuse, to end alcoholism, to end nicotine addiction,
opiate
to end
addiction.
a lot of big, and those addictions that these limited use substances challenge our industries in this country. The opioid industry, the nicotine industry, the alcohol industry, that is all legal.
So to just be extremely factual.
Get real factual.
I'm just because we have been given certain perspectives about certain chemicals in our lives that are not our natural perspectives. That's not the perspective you would have if you were born onto a desert island and one day you walked out onto the beach and there was a table with an aspirin, a cup of coffee, a cup of alcohol, a tab of acid, a pipe with some marijuana in it.
You would have no judgment on any of that.
You would not have any moral judgment about those things sitting on that table.
You might have feelings about each one afterwards.
You would try them, and then you would feel your own thoughts about whether you liked that thing or not,
or whether you found it useful, whether it was good for you or not
Yeah.
good for you. Not everything is good for everybody.
And so, in our country, we have been given the mentality that if you don't like alcohol, you're probably a pussy. Very few people in the U.S. would just don't drink for no reason. A lot of people don't drink because they abused it in the past and can't drink anymore now without abusing it.
A lot of people don't drink because they don't like it.
A lot of people don't drink because they don't like it, but there's still that stigma. If you hang out with people who drink, why don't you want one? Just have one. It'll be fine.
The peer pressure of the kids.
It's completely understood that everybody drinks caffeine. Lots of people don't drink caffeine, but a lot of people do use caffeine. Some people even abuse caffeine. I had a friend in college who never ate vegetables but lived off of Red Bull. Lived off of caffeine. People abuse painkillers. People abuse muscle relaxers. People abuse wine. People can use and abuse any substance, but we have a variety of mentalities around those things that have largely been given to us by popular society, and those mentalities were largely given to popular society by the people in power, which is people in governments and people in financial sectors. And what I wanted to say factually about financial sectors is that there are companies who make money every time someone is prescribed oxycodone. There are no companies that make money when you're given MDMA. Now there are companies that make money when someone is given marijuana for back pain, and there are also people in prison for having marijuana for back pain at the same time. There are a variety of substances that are legal to take when you have pain or when you have trauma or depression that someone is making money off of. And there are a bunch of substances that will enable you to be free of pain, trauma, and depression that are not legal because nobody would be making money off of them.
So to quote Bill Hicks, so it doesn't make any sense
that the things that free you from addiction, pain, and trauma are illegal.
It makes no sense. But we accept it.
Yeah.
Just like 1984. We accept it because we didn't have it to begin with, most of us, so we're not missing it.
Yeah.
It's only been a part of the story of humans since as far back as we know.
What has?
Neurochemicals in the form of botanicals.
Eating things to
Morning
change your
glory
mind.
seeds, mushrooms,
Willow bark
marijuana,
for
hash. Yes, it's only been a part of our story forever. Now
pain. Humans medicate.
we
Now
don't
we are
have
not free.
the Schedule 1 drug policy has robbed us of our cognitive liberty, our ability to have non-ordinary experiences. And you can go down a lot of different rabbit holes about why that might be. There's very simple ones that were admitted by the architects, which is racial and war, criminalizing the anti-war movement, criminalizing black people with heroin and marijuana criminalization. Admittedly designed to criminalize those people through substances that were not doing, the substances themselves were not the problem.
Right.
But now you've criminalized the substance, which criminalized the people who were using them and not committing crimes, not having negative experiences. You criminalize those people. So yeah, it's racial, yes. Racially motivated, yes. About the war machine, yes, it was motivated. There are other more nuanced reasons why that has still remained a part of our drug policy. If you are on a partisan political side, if you are Republican or if you are a Democrat, neither of those parties have done anything to get rid of the blatant racial motivation, racial and class motivation to keep these drugs criminalized. Neither one of them has done anything to change it. That's a problem. So when people say there's no difference between the parties, and people say, well, there's a big difference because of the New Deal that happened 100 years ago.
Democrats are better.
The differences are getting smaller and smaller. And when you have a drug policy that puts people in jail for doing non-violent, non-criminal things, and neither party is addressing that, that is a battle between the government and freedom of thought, cognitive liberty, your ability to use substances to develop your own psyche, your own ability to think and to cognate.
And even if you are not trying to use that substance to become a more enlightened human, you should still have the freedom to eat what you want to eat. Humans should be free to eat what they want to eat. Humans are free to eat aspirin. We are free to eat alcohol. We are free to eat caffeine. But we are not free to eat mushrooms. We are not free to eat acid. We are not free to eat marijuana.
So if it were free, if it were legal to take mushrooms or to take ecstasy, all you need to do is go to... Now, in Denver, it's legal now in Denver. It's legal for mushrooms.
Psychedelic mushrooms.
Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz voted to decriminalize mushrooms. Washington, D.C. just took a major step towards adding legalization to its November 2020 ballots. Chicago city leaders passed a resolution supporting scientific and medicinal research with the goal of decriminalization. Vermont lawmakers filed a bill to decriminalize it as well. Even Oregon is pushing to legalize psilocybin mushrooms for therapeutic purposes. So it's not in the news very much. People who are upset about our current political state, about people who are on the left that are upset about Trump, people who are on the right that are upset about looming socialism of the left, that battle, I think, becomes fairly moot when you start taking mushrooms, when you start using mushrooms. Those battles become small and dumb when another vista opens up before you.
We talk about trying to get the bigger picture a lot of the time. Humans want to have the bigger picture. Most humans want to know what the bigger picture is. I need to get a better perspective on this. I need to take a step back.
So when people say, right now we just have to get rid of Trump, who cares if Biden doesn't want to make who is still saying marijuana is a gateway drug when the majority of the states are moving towards legalization?
Biden just recently said that he still thinks marijuana is a gateway drug.
So for people who say that's not an issue for today,
that's
right now we have to deal with fascism. This is fascism.
We see that flipped. We see the war on your ability to be free to do what you
to
want
think correctly
with your body,
or to think differently than the status quo, is how we change having
That's
a
the
game
bigger
show
problem.
host at the White House.
That's the bigger problem than the presidential debate.
Yes. That's my assessment of the current situation. That's
Yeah.
that's why we're doing a 2-part series on our drug policy and what is considered a drug and what is considered harm.
So I have some definitions I could read.
Very good.
Because I think it is important. When I think of the word crime, I think harm. I think somebody hurt somebody else, or took somebody else's stuff, or hurt somebody else, or took somebody else's stuff. Like when I think crimes, I think breaking and entering, or beating somebody up, or drunk driving, or these sorts of things. Like I think of those as crimes.
Yeah.
But what crime has actually been redefined to mean is just anything against the law. So anything that's illegal is now a crime. So you can be a criminal even if you were never hurting anyone or infringing on their rights.
Suddenly you will be treated as a criminal by the law, by your neighbors, should they find out that you are breaking the law, even though you've committed no actual harm.
You have done no harm.
To yourself or anybody else.
So in Montana, you can walk around drunk outside.
You can drink walking around.
You can go to a park.
In Butte in particular.
You can go to a park and drink in the park in the summertime with a picnic. You can be drunk late at night in Butte. In Illinois, you cannot be drunk in public. You may only drink in a bar or drink in your home. You may not be drunk in public.
You have to somehow be sober between the bar and when you get home.
Right. You're supposed to take a taxi, I guess. But in both of those places, if you are drunk, in Butte, if you are drunk and you shove someone and they fall and hurt themselves and the police see it, that's a problem.
That's a problem.
If you are drunk and you're driving and you hurt someone, that's a problem. So crime and harm should be synonymous, but they're not synonymous anymore. Now crime just means the government said don't do it, so it's a crime. So someone can be treated like a criminal in Illinois who is not a criminal in Montana, even though they were both doing the exact same thing and neither one of them harmed anyone. Drug. Let's do some definitions. A drug is a medicine or other substance which has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced to the body.
That's a lot of stuff.
A medicine or other substance.
Chocolate.
That changes your body when you eat it.
Chocolate.
Caffeine.
Yeah.
Aspirin. Broccoli. That horrible pee that happens after you eat asparagus. That's a physiological effect from something you ingested. Right. So we need to dispel fear. We cannot adventure, explore, or evolve if we are living in fear. You literally cannot evolve when you are living in fear. And so if we have a fear of the word drug, there is no way for us to change our minds or become free. Fear is prison. So
that old commercial which I showed you,
with the creepy angry dad?
Yeah, the creepy angry dad. The 1985's authoritarian.
And the handheld camera, like a camcorder, like he's making his teen son video it for him.
This is your brain on drugs, where the man takes an egg and throws it in the frying pan, and he says, all right, you guys are idiots. This is the subtext.
Yeah.
You're morons if you're doing drugs.
Because what he said in the video that I've never heard before, he's like, do we really need to have this conversation again?
Do we have to do this? Right.
Yeah.
So he says, let me explain it to you very clearly.
Yeah. This is your brain.
This is your brain, and he takes an egg, and he puts it in a very hot frying pan and fries it, and then shows you that it says, any questions? Any questions?
And he's got like this angry cop dad face.
Very angry cop dad face. So that was the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, a nice Ronald Reagan initiative.
If you do drugs, obviously you're stupid.
So this is very Orwellian, in that he said, don't abuse drugs. That's not what he said.
Nope.
Just don't do drugs.
Drugs.
Now, if we took his advice and didn't do drugs, we would probably starve to death and die.
Right. If we were going off the dictionary definition of drug.
If they nuanced their definition of drug, they couldn't have their campaign.
And if they nuanced what do means, they wouldn't have a campaign either.
They wouldn't have a campaign. So the don't do drugs campaign is classic 20th century American propaganda.
Brainwashing.
It's brainwashing.
It's lying to the citizens and making the citizens think they're doing something for their own good. Don't do drugs is not about you or your loved ones being healthy and happy. Don't abuse anything is about you and your loved ones being happy and healthy. Some people abuse caffeine and develop heart problems.
To quote Bill Hicks, he said, "I've done a lot of drugs and I've never once thought that an egg was a brain, but maybe I wasn't getting good stuff."
So let's do some more definitions.
Okay.
Medicine. A compound or preparation used for the treatment or prevention of disease, especially a drug or drugs taken by mouth. Medicine is a compound or preparation used for the treatment of disease or the prevention of disease.
Dis-ease. Anxiety is a dis-ease.
So is depression.
That's a dis-ease. You're not at ease.
Right.
Right.
So a medicine is anything that is used to treat or prevent disease, unhealthiness.
So it's fairly evident that, I think we've hammered this 2 weeks in a row, evident that our drug policy is not only wrong but harmful. It is itself a crime because it has caused harm. The drug policy has caused tremendous harm, death, mayhem. It has caused mayhem. It's criminal. The drug policy is criminal. So that's why I think it's kind of important to talk about that, because people die all the time because of that policy. It's not just, I want to smoke pot and get high.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people that think when you're trying to get marijuana legalized, oh, it's just about smoking pot and getting high. It's about ending a criminal drug policy.
A brainwashing campaign that has been going on for like 70 years.
So I think it's encouraging that most of the states have accepted marijuana as something that is not criminal. And now more and more places are starting to accept mushrooms as something that is not criminal.
As in not causing anyone harm.
Not causing anyone any harm.
If you take mushrooms, I can't even imagine a situation when someone would cause harm on mushrooms. If you take mushrooms and duke it out with somebody in a fist fight, it wasn't the mushrooms that did it.
It wasn't the mushrooms that did it. Right.
If you maybe got to a point where you realized you actually were faking how much you liked that person and didn't want to put up with their crap anymore. I have a couple other definitions here.
Okay, good.
Substance.
All right.
We talk a lot about substance abuse.
Yes.
Substance.
Substance. Wait, you're just going to define the word substance?
Yes!
Okay, go.
Because we hear substance abuse and we're like, oh no, not substances.
Define it.
An intoxicating, stimulating, or narcotic chemical or drug, especially an illegal one. Now let's look at the definition of narcotic. A narcotic is a drug or substance that affects the mood or behavior and is sold for non-medical purposes, especially an illegal one. I think that's really interesting. So it can be, we've invented a word for substances that if they were sold legally would be called a medicine or a drug. But if they're sold illegally, we call them a narcotic, even though it's the same thing. Heroin is a narcotic. Oxycodone, which is heroin, is a drug or substance. It's the same substance, but we call it a drug or medicine when it's sold legally, and we call it a narcotic when it is sold illegally.
Caleb Hill commented.
Snap, that's great.
Caleb says, the irony is that police in America were armed with military-grade weaponry, convinced they were at war within their own country, and were handed an addiction to power, a drug in itself. I would say we're defining our terms right now. It was not a drug. Power is not a drug because you don't physically ingest it, just to be a nitpicker. But yes, because of the war on drugs, every major police force in this country was militarized. And it's a part of the military-industrial complex problem. So when the military buys tons of gear and we don't blow it all up because we don't really need it all, we don't use it all, it becomes obsolete. So you give it to the police department to fight the war on drugs, and then you have a militarized police department. That way they can buy new stuff at the federal level. They donated I think one of these big, those big rigs that has 6 wheels and turrets and a sound cannon, they donated that to the Bozeman Police Department like they need that.
The Bozeman Police Department now has a gigantic tank.
I think they rejected it. I think I remember hearing them saying,
we don't
really want that.
I don't want to have this in my house in case I think I need to use it.
But places like Los Angeles, Oakland, Dallas, Atlanta, New York, they have their own standing armies now because of the gear that came from the military-industrial complex, and the method to do it was the drug policy, because we have to protect, because the war that we were in.
What you're saying is, in spite of our government's best efforts to be at war for the last 100 years straight,
yes,
we're still not using all of our federal military war supplies. So there's like extra war supplies that the U.S. has bought that we haven't used up, even though we've been at war for 100 years. And so in order to keep buying more military stuff...
What do you do? Well, they just often just let it rot in a field. They'll just let it rot in a field.
The federal military gives war toys to local police departments so that they need to buy more war stuff so that we can keep our war budget agreements with other countries who are selling us war stuff.
The war on drugs was not a euphemism. They militarized what should be a health issue. It should be a health issue, a mental health issue, or a physical health issue. It should never have been a war issue. And we allowed them to do that. We still allow them to do that. Last week we talked extensively about the book Smoke and Mirrors, about the designing of the drug policy, and in 1997 it was revealed that it was a racist policy, and at that moment I thought, great, finally we'll deal with it. We haven't dealt with it, the Democrats haven't dealt with it, the Libertarians, that's one of the good things. That's why the Libertarians are still in the world as far as I'm concerned, because they say it's none of our business what you do with your drugs. It's not our business. Republicans and Democrats are still being funded by the industries that are protected by the drug war, which is nicotine, pharmaceuticals, and alcohol. The drug war keeps those propped up as your substance of choice, while the things that keep you from being addicted to that are now illegal. It's not rocket science.
If you use alcohol in your home or at a bar or at a party and have a great time and don't infringe on anybody's rights, that's great. If you abuse alcohol in your home or at a bar or at a party and you do harm someone or infringe on someone else's rights, that should be a crime. If you use marijuana at home or in a bar or at a party and you don't harm anyone or infringe on anybody's rights, that should be your right.
No, they should put you in solitary confinement and beat you for that.
Let's talk about use versus abuse.
Okay.
To use something is to take hold of something or deploy it as a means of accomplishing a purpose or achieving a result.
All right.
Seems pretty productive to me.
Yeah.
To abuse something is to use it to bad effect or for a bad purpose, to misuse it. And this is where we have to talk about religion again.
Ooh.
Because if you drink alcohol in your home and get drunk and pass out watching The Office, you are not abusing alcohol because you have not used it for a bad purpose. If you use alcohol and get drunk and hit your wife because you haven't processed your anger over getting fired, you have now abused alcohol. But many people in many religious groups think that you drinking alcohol is abuse, even if you don't do anything to anybody else. 25% of the country identifies as evangelical Christian. That is probably the most conservative Christian group in the U.S. 25% of U.S. citizens call themselves evangelical. 70% of U.S. citizens still call themselves Christians. A lot of those people have opinions about homosexuality, about being in a relationship with somebody you're not married to, about alcohol, about marijuana, and those opinions say that even if what you're doing doesn't cause harm to anyone, you still shouldn't be allowed to do it. It is still abuse. A lot of people in religious circles and people influenced by religion who don't know they have opinions because of the widespread propagation of religious opinions think that things you do with yourself that don't cause harm to anybody else are still wrong. even if you are in a consensual relationship with somebody of the same gender, that is still abuse. It's still wrong, and it should still be a crime. And they get those opinions from their leader's interpretation of religious texts. So we have an argument in the US of use versus abuse, because a huge portion of the civilians in the US, our neighbors, think that certain things are abusive even when no one is being hurt.
Well, like in 1984, limiting what you can say and what you can't say, taking words from the lexicon so that instead of talking about the spectrum of chemicals, drugs, and plants, you just say drugs.
Mm-hmm.
That narrows, and so drugs are bad.
It simplifies the word, and we make that word bad, and so anytime...
No, they actually just said drugs are bad.
Yeah.
Over and over, and now people who were raised in it, it's a trope and it's a joke, and yet even when we use it jokingly, there's a part of it so much embedded in our culture that it's dumbfounding, and I think we've become dumbfounded by this relentless anti-drug war on drug campaign, so that we can't think straight.
And so we get to the cookie jar problem.
Yes, tell us about the cookie jar problem.
Well, you want to do things you're not supposed to do more than you want to do things you're allowed to do. It's human nature. It's animal nature.
Grass is always greener kind of thing?
Fences are designed to be jumped.
Sure.
Humans and other animals...
We like to break boundaries.
Want to do... If you put a dog on a chain, it will immediately go figure out how long the chain is. This is observed from time immemorial.
Yeah.
The Bible says stolen water is sweet.
Sure.
Like, it's more fun to eat cookie dough out of the fridge as a 13-year-old and try to eat it in a way that your mom won't know you stole some than it is to go buy yourself a tube of cookie dough at the grocery store. But a lot of people will buy themselves tubes of cookie dough at the grocery store and eat the whole thing because they were raised in an environment that was extremely prohibitive and they weren't free to make their own choices. And so eating raw cookie dough is still fun for them, even though they're an adult and they can do whatever the heck they want.
Yes.
Addiction, or addicted. Addicted means physically and mentally dependent on a particular substance and unable to stop taking it without incurring adverse effects. Adverse effects could be your body goes into toxic shock because you suddenly stop drinking alcohol, or you go into a deep state of depression because you suddenly stop taking something else that was keeping you from being depressed. People are addicted to antidepressants.
Masking your depression. Yeah.
People are addicted to antidepressants. People are addicted to caffeine. An adverse effect is if I stop drinking caffeine, I will get headaches, I will be irritable, and I won't be able to perform at work as well as I normally do.
Right.
Addicted, physically and mentally dependent, often mentally dependent because you're mentally dependent on the physical state of being that substance gives you, and unable to stop taking it without incurring adverse effects. This is not just about illegal substances or dangerous substances.
No.
Schedule 1 drugs are supposed to be drugs that are addictive. We got to talk about that.
Yeah.
I don't think any substance is addictive. I think addictive is an incorrect word. I don't think anything is addictive. That was part of the brainwashing campaign, was that certain things will just make you addicted.
Well, I think there's some brainwashing to that campaign. I don't know if I share that perspective that you have.
How would you phrase it?
Let's say somebody tied you up and gave you regular doses of heroin and then quit the heroin. You would be addicted at that point.
Yeah.
When you were done, after they administered the stuff and you were forced to take it on a regular basis, so your body was adapted to it, and then you withdrew that source, you would feel that you would know that you would clearly be addicted and know what it means to be addicted. That substance, you're not going to get that same substance with bologna. If they tied you up and fed you bologna, and they were through feeding you bologna, you're not going to go like, oh, I got to have some. It's a different effect on the body.
Okay.
So I think they've abused the idea
and expanded it beyond
that the drug has an addictive power to grab you.
Right. Well, you know what else is addictive is video gaming.
It's been shown to be addictive. You get a neurochemical high.
Running is addictive.
You get a neurochemical high, yes.
Sex is addictive.
Yes.
So I would say broccoli probably isn't. Caffeine is.
Caffeine has been called. You just said you didn't think anything was addictive.
I'm changing my mind.
Okay, good.
I think I was hoping to find an easy way to try to break down the narrative that drugs have a magical ability to hook you for no reason. Because we've been taught that addiction is just something that happens to people,
Right.
and that's why you should never even try anything in case you get magically hooked by the substance, because the substance has a magical power to hook you. That's what I was trying to dispel easily, but obviously it's got to be a more nuanced conversation. People don't become addicted for no reason. Addiction is a symptom of unhappiness.
I think you have a lot to go back to the Judeo-Christian layer that's over our country. You don't do certain things because they're bad. 10 Commandments, whatever. The devil is trying to get you, etc. That is easily translates to this. Try this. The substance, just replace this devil with the substance with devil. You just don't tangle with it, right? You don't dine with the devil. Even with a long spoon, you just don't associate with it. You don't do it.
They're giving chemicals that you can put into your body this supernatural power of hooking you against your will, which is like
gnarly.
So much of the kind of Christianity that is widely practiced in the U.S. teaches people that they don't have the ability to have command of their own thoughts and behaviors.
Disclaimer, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I use all those qualitative words.
Well, I need to qualify what I'm saying. There's the model of Judeo-Christianity that we use in this country, the larger overriding there's evangelical, and there's all these various kinds. The general theme, culturally accepted theme, is what I'm talking about. Not the loving Christians, not the gay Christians that say that, not Christians. I'm talking about core
there's a brand
aspects of the model.
There's a brand in the U.S. that is the widespread brand of Christianity that says even if you're in a consensual relationship with a man to man, that is still wrong. It says you should not have marijuana even though it could be good for you. It says
meth no matter
never once, not even once. Because the brainwashing campaign of the war on drugs has given meth this supernatural ability to just hook you for no reason. You wouldn't even know why. It would just suddenly make you addicted to it.
I understand when you live in a nation where 18 to 24% of the folks still think the sun revolves around the earth, why you would make some campaign that's easily accessible to people who think the sun revolves around the earth.
You want to get the message out to all levels of civilians.
To all levels, and that means making it really dumb, which is drugs are bad. This is your brain on drugs. That's really dumb and not accurate, and not even a good metaphor. It's not. None of it really worked. It was just very simple in terms of drugs bad.
Scary scene with scary dad.
Drugs bad, drugs bad. Just keep hammering that for several decades, and that's for people who manage societies would say we are doing harm reduction by keeping dangerous things out of the hands of idiots.
Except alcohol.
That's where the whole thing breaks down.
It just breaks down because if it's actually, if our government,
if it was really trying to be good to us,
if our government was actually enforcing rules upon us for our safety, alcohol would be illegal.
It would.
Because it has no medical benefit and it is highly addictive.
You just have to have a good lobby. Marijuana finally got a good enough lobby that now guys in suits are investing in marijuana, and now we can have marijuana.
Even though millions of Americans are still in prison because of marijuana.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think a lot of people have found relief from the idea that addiction is genetic. It's not me. It was a disease that was given to me.
I got it.
I can't control I shouldn't feel badly that it's hard for me to control my substance use because my mom was on cocaine when I was in the belly.
So there's a study that connects trauma with addiction, and trauma is so easily passed down generation to generation. Because if you don't deal with your trauma, you end up traumatizing the next generation.
Treating your kids the same way you were treated.
In the same way, or overcompensating and traumatizing them in the opposite way.
The other direction.
Pendulum swing the other way.
Yeah.
So I think addiction can be inherited in the sense that the tie between addiction and trauma.
So do you think poverty is genetic?
In the same way, like if you're poor and you're making bad choices, and those bad choices cause a lot of anxiety, fear, and suffering, you're raising a person in that they're not free cognitively or physically or financially to develop themselves, feeling like they can actually go out. Instead of just defending themselves against being crushed by an economic problem their entire life, they can move forward and try to be a person in the world. So I don't know if it's genetic. I think if you have a group, there are people who've been poor for generations and then suddenly that cycle is broken. I think genetics play a part. I don't think it's all in whole.
I think genetic memory is something that we probably don't study enough.
Yeah.
I like this video game series called Assassin's Creed, where you play a character in the modern age named Desmond, who goes into a machine, a mind-reading machine called the Animus, where they go down through his genetic history and send him into the past to replay scenes of his ancestors' lives. Because there's a lot of evidence that your genes and your typology and your presentation as a person and your opinions and feelings are sort of a sandwich of all of your ancestors before you. So they go back into his DNA and literally go find an ancestor in his DNA, and he reenacts those lives. And I think originally I really wanted to, again, I wanted a simple answer. I wanted to be like, we are focusing, because the conversation that drugs can magically addict you by their supernatural drug power, and the conversation that addiction is hereditary and you can just be given it, keeps us from talking about what I think is the real problem, which is that people in the US are having a horrible time, and we try to pass off something as happy and healthy that is not happy and healthy. Yeah. I think
alcohol, all those smiling drunk people who are never drunk.
And no, I mean the life.
The life in general.
People try to say, okay, you live in a home, you're married, you have 2 kids, you have a good job, you're paying your bills, you have a dog, you are the picture of happy and healthy. And we try to pass that off as happy and healthy, and then we're like, I don't know, he became addicted out of nowhere. He's just an alcoholic now. People don't just become alcoholics for no reason. You do not, when you are happy and healthy, you do not seek to escape from your experience in real life. Addiction is escapism. Addiction is, I need to not feel the way I normally feel.
Distract myself from myself.
Yes. Video games, running, mountain climbing, freebasing. Freebasing, isn't that when you jump off a mountain?
No, that's base jumping.
Oops.
Freebasing is smoking crack.
Oops. Well, I mean, yes. but still, all of these, addiction is escapism because I don't want to feel the way that I want to feel. And you will keep doing it until the way that you feel changes, which is why things like ketamine, LSD, MDMA, psilocybin enable people to free themselves from addiction, because those substances enable you to feel differently than the way you've always been feeling, so you don't need to run away from your own life anymore.
We have a comment from Sean Yardy.
My chat bot isn't working today, so I didn't see it.
Oh. I can read it.
I would love to see that. Yeah.
Sean Yardy says, should the government protect us from bad things? Question mark.
No. Wait, no.
There's more to go.
Okay, I'm going to listen. That's not my immediate answer. I just blurted that out because I'm all fired up.
Drugs, violence, knowledge, viruses. Oh, wait. Drugs, violence, knowledge, viruses. How much trust should be given to people in power? We should trust them on the virus when they lie about drugs? Question mark. trust they have told us the truth about history when they deprive us of knowledge for profit. In a corporate oligarchy, you are expected to believe and support the status quo even when your reality tells you it is incorrect. If you don't, you're a nut. If you start to raise a threatening amount of awareness, you're in prison. Freedom is a facade. We have what they let us have.
Yes. And in large part, the widespread Christian brand being spread over the US causes us to trust people in authority to know better about what's good for us than we know. So even though you may have an experience with a chemical that was a beneficial experience to you,
you can't talk about it.
You will still think of yourself as probably a bad person. Because the people in authority told you that's wrong.
Well, I would, from my own experiences, I would not say that you would think of yourself necessarily as a bad person, but you will still have behaviors akin to a criminal.
Many people do think of themselves as bad people, and it perpetuates
Sure.
the shame-guilt cycle. If you're smoking,
whether you think it's bad or not, if you're behaving as a criminal, you're outside the civic circle. You're no longer feeling fully a part of your body, of your community, because the law is saying if you speak too freely about what your life is or what you do, we will jail you.
Making something illegal perpetuates abuse and addiction.
Yeah.
Enables, creates, and perpetuates addiction.
So the thing about drugs are bad in order to get the lowest common denominator, to protect the lowest common denominator. That's the narrative, right? But they still say, go drink all the alcohol you want and beat your wife, which blows that thing out. His question is, should you trust the government? And I would say yes. Ideally, we should.
We should be able to,
because it's
supposed to be representative of what's good for the citizens.
We should be able to trust our government because the government is supposed to be made up of us. It's not supposed to be somebody else.
Right.
It's supposed to be made up of us. So ideally, we should be able to trust the government about tracking our phones to keep us safe from coronavirus, or telling us that this substance may have harm. Give me some information, and I'd say, oh, you've given me some information. I can proceed or not proceed. It's on me now.
Make a critical thinking decision about what is healthy and happy for myself.
So we can't rely, it's hard to trust a government when you have a reality game show host running it and another clown running against them, and you're supposed to choose between the two. It's really difficult to say that you can trust the government. Past things that have come up, MK Ultra, just one thing that we mentioned in the show, past Tuskegee Airmen, the things that have come up tell us that it would be unwise to give full credence to the government in terms of our protection or our edification. So that's the unfortunate part. I would like to live in a world where the system of governance reflects who I am in my community, and that we could trust. I could pay some money and somebody could do some research and tell me the best way to prepare before I do MDMA at the rave.
And
that's the government that I want.
That's that ad campaign from Norway that I shared last week. Like, this is what we should be doing. The point is that people should not be dying.
That's the point.
That's what the ad campaign that I shared last week from Norway was doing, is they put up a bunch of billboards and posters at bus stations and subway stations and things, and it was like, David did heroin last night and did not die because he knew not to mix it with such and such.
Right.
Sarah drank too much last night and did not die because her friends knew they could call the hospital without going to prison. The point is that you do not die.
That's the point.
But because of the widespread modern brand of Christianity, that certain things that you do are just bad, whether you're harming anybody or not, people let their friends overdose on the carpet because they're afraid of going to jail.
Or afraid of telling their parents.
Yeah.
Because of the religious stuff. Yeah.
Because they might go to hell. So we only have a little bit left in the show. We wanted to talk about, as more correlatory evidence for it's not availability of the substance that causes addiction or abuse. it's the lifestyle and mindset around that substance that causes addiction or abuse.
Yeah, quick fact, drug war has been going on since 74. More drugs, better, purer drugs, more gang violence, more death, more addiction,
More imprisonment.
more imprisonment. The war has not worked. We know that. So
if you want to look at the timeline of events, if you were to be a person 300 years in the future that looked at the timeline of events and correlated that with the addiction, imprisonment, and abuse data of the last 80 years, you would observe that the war on drugs created a crisis of drug abuse in the U.S.
Right.
Making drugs illegal and policing them as if they were a crime created a drug crisis because of the cookie jar problem.
Yes.
So I wanted to talk, I shared a link in our video.
Okay.
Rats prefer social interaction to heroin or methamphetamine.
Okay.
This is from drugabuse.gov.
Now, by the way, I want to play devil's advocate because I know I was talking about this article last week.
Okay.
Because in looking for that article, and I haven't done enough research into this article because I just found it during the show. It says this 38-year-old study is still spreading bad ideas about addiction. The Rat Park study was flawed in its findings and have been oversimplified, but it keeps getting cited. So I think we should post both and let people decide for themselves between the two articles. I thought that was interesting.
What did they say again?
So the Rat Park study was, the premise was that we did studies on addiction and it was done on miserable rats isolated in cages.
Right.
And so, of course, they were addicted because they were miserable and isolated.
Yeah.
So they did another study with rats in a park where they had toys and social
Years
and activity.
later, the original study was made to prove that animals are naturally addicted.
Naturally addicted to
Don't
these
even do
things.
it once.
Right. So then they did another study and they're like, oh, they didn't go and get addicted to these other things because they weren't miserable, isolated souls.
They were in a large
they were happier,
social cage with
didn't need
plenty
to
of
escape.
food,
Yeah.
plenty of toys.
So I have not read this article yet, but I thought I want to include it in the comments because I always like to hear all sides of the story.
And what was
I haven't read it yet.
But what were they saying? They were saying
They're
it's
saying
oversimplified.
it was flawed in its findings, and the findings have been oversimplified, but it keeps getting cited. So that's what they're saying. So they're saying there's more to that study than what some people have made of it. So I just shared that into the comments if you want to go down that road because I don't. Last week I quoted it. I'm one of those people that they're saying that I cited it and it was flawed. So
well, I'm curious to see why they say it's flawed.
I'm curious to see who wrote it.
I'm curious to know who funded the person writing the article saying that rats don't like heroin as much when they're happy and healthy.
Katie.
Yeah, who's funding Katie?
I don't know who's funding Katie. I don't know.
We wanted to talk a lot today about plausible. Do you have to pee really badly?
Yeah. Well, I rolled the chair onto my sock.
Oh, I was like, why is he wiggling around so damn much?
Because my foot was stuck because I rolled the chair onto my sock. And I have to pee.
Can you last another 10 minutes?
We'll find out.
We wanted to talk about harm reduction.
Okay.
And plausible actions, plausible steps towards decriminalization. There's a difference between criminalization and legalization. Are you going to be able to concentrate, or do you just need to go pee?
No, why don't you start that dialogue, because I know a little bit. I'll be right back.
You're just sort of staring off into space towards me.
Go.
So, harm reduction is the point of the war on drugs is to just keep people from doing drugs. You might say, oh, that's harm reduction, except that mentality, keeping people from doing drugs, is harm reduction, comes from a perspective that drugs are harmful. So, if we're to back out from that perspective that was given to us, which is that don't do drugs is harm reduction because drugs are harmful, and we look at all of the evidence that we've been sharing today about how these substances do not cause harm when they are used correctly, then just preventing people from using drugs is not actually, it's not the best form of harm reduction because people are still going to do it. Much like just teaching children in school to not have sex is not harm reduction, because children are still going to experiment with their bodies and other people's bodies. For a metaphor, actual harm reduction in sex education would be explaining how sexually transmitted diseases actually transmit, explaining how to prevent pregnancy when you don't want to be pregnant, explaining how to say, I don't want to do this anymore, and then how to say, okay, I don't want to do anything with you you don't want to do. That is actual harm reductive sex education. Right. But because our sex education is informed by this modern brand of Judeo-Christianity, which says you're only supposed to have sex when you're married to a person of the opposite gender forever, and so you should just not have sex. And so if we teach children how to have safe sex, they'll have more sex, and that will be wrong, because you're not supposed to have sex unless you're heterosexually monogamously married your whole life. That's not harm reduction. And so we think about, keep that metaphor in mind, and we move to drug policies. Just saying don't do them is not harm reduction, because people are still going to experiment with their bodies. And so actual harm reductive steps would be education about the substances, what they do to you, how you will probably feel, which will reduce your anxiety about a new experience, how to not mix them with other substances so that you do not die, and ways that you can help a friend who's having a negative experience on these substances. Harm reduction actions, actual harm reduction, not just don't do it because it's sinful. Actual harm reduction is having sites all over where people can go and be trained how to safely inject themselves. They're going to do it anyway, and you can have phlebotomists teach people how to inject themselves safely so they don't blow out a blood vessel, so that they don't inject it into the wrong part of their body and die, because that should be the point, that you do not die.
Should be the point.
Harm reduction is needle exchanges. We used to have a needle exchange in Butte, and the Christian community in Butte rejected a renewal of the needle exchange program because people aren't supposed to be doing needle drugs. So you used to be able to go get clean needles and have a safe and non-criminal place to turn in your old drug needles. Now
so they find all over the street.
They find drug needles in the park.
They're all over the park.
They're all over Butte. But saying we're not going to help you do drugs is thought of as harm reduction, when actually enabling people to safely dispose of their needles without going to prison and get new needles so that they are not transmitting diseases amongst each other by sharing their needles is actual harm reduction. I'm going to post a couple of links in our live feed for websites that give harm reductive information about the chemicals that are in the market today. One of those sites is Erowid.
One of my favorites, go to all the time.
EROWID.com.
I think it's org.
.org. Erowid is the oldest, most. They have scientific articles. They have trip reports, which is other people talking about their experiences, so you can figure out if you want to do something or not. And they have data about where is it? Erowid. It is erowid.org. Okay, and then the other one is Roll Safe, which is specifically about MDMA/ecstasy/ what's the other name for it? Molly. Which is one of the most popular party drugs in the U.S. today. And
comes in all kinds of forms.
And a lot of them are mixed, and a lot of them are not safe, because we don't have places you can go to get your drugs tested to see if they're actually safe and clean. Because all drugs are unsafe, so you just shouldn't be taking them. So we're not going to test yours, because if you have sex outside of marriage and get pregnant or get an STD, that's what you deserved, because you were doing something wrong. And how will you learn if you don't have consequences?
It's a very punitive culture.
Yeah.
The one that you're speaking of.
Well, that's most of the U.S.
Yeah. So Erowid is a good site if you want information on. It's a collection site. So links to articles, a vault for various chemicals. So if you want to know about psilocybin, you can go to the vault and get the scientific reports. You can get first-person experience reports. You can get news reports.
The history of its
use. It's one of those wonderful organizations that's always hanging on by a thread. financially,
Mhm.
but they keep they've been up for years, and I recommend them as a resource for a wide variety of perspectives on a substance versus the propaganda that we basically see whenever you Google something. The propaganda is usually, unfortunately, the first thing that comes up.
Yeah, we talked about that a lot last week. If you're trying to look for actual information, actually medically, scientifically based information for the benefits of cannabis, you won't find it in the first 3 pages of Google results. You will find things about how cannabis causes schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sharing a link to that New York Times article that you found, or the New Yorker, I should say.
The New Yorker, yeah. Very different.
Which is a story about the, let's see, what do they say? A field guide to psychedelics. The Trip Planners, the unusual couple behind an online encyclopedia of psychoactive substances.
And so they're the ones that are behind Arrowwood.
And 710 and 805 on Twitch shares leafly.com, LEAFLY.com, for accurate cannabis info. Accurate cannabis information about the different strains and the uses and what you should or shouldn't mix it with and the kinds of experiences that you might have. Sean Yardy says, weed bad, Mountain Dew good. Can we just talk about harmful substances that are legal? Soda is so harmful.
Pretty harmful.
My church would pour...
I was addicted to Coca-Cola in high school.
You can't be addicted to soda. What are you talking about?
Caffeine.
You can't be addicted to soda.
I was so addicted.
Soda's not an addictive substance.
It was my first real drug.
You substance abused soda.
Yep.
My church used to take a 2-liter bottle of soda and pour it on our
our
metal steps outside our church to melt the ice in the wintertime. And one winter, they just melted all the way through.
Oh, that's not good on metal. Yeah.
How is something that destroys metal okay for my teeth and my gastrointestinal tract?
No, I don't think there's a defense for that.
things that are legal and not
Coca-Cola was
legal.
my gateway drug.
Your gateway drug.
I was addicted to Coke. I was a fiend for Coke. Like, I would swill it down. So I like the bubbles. I like the sugar. Sugar, talk about an addiction.
Sugar is extremely addictive.
Sugar is often all of our first addiction.
Sugar lights up the brain more than cocaine lights up the brain.
So sugar was my first addiction. Sugar and caffeine were my twin addictions. I was rolling on 2 substances at the same time all the time.
Up. Can't be down.
Yep.
Home life sucks. Dad's abusive.
And then
Gotta stay up.
From there, immediately went into nicotine because it also gave me a high. I started chain smoking cigarettes because I built up this ramped up idea of how to be on top of things, and it was through caffeine and sugar.
You only knew yourself on substances.
And then I threw nicotine on top of caffeine and sugar and did that for a good decade or so.
That's why, some of the best science and actual honest conversations about substances is to talk about how it's important to not be dabbling in altering substances while you are figuring out who you are. Don't. One might say,
as the brain is still developing,
one might say it's wise to figure out who you are, ground zero, square one, before trying altering substances.
Who says that?
I think it's good advice.
I took a different route. I didn't know who I was, and it was.
I know.
Yeah.
I think that's sad. I think it's sad that you couldn't be yourself.
Right.
For your teens, and because like I have a friend that I did acid with who experienced acid in her teens as an escapism party drug. She had a horrible life growing up, and she would go and do acid to get away from all of that. And so she is never really comfortable with herself because she was never really with herself. We're not saying everybody should just be free to do everything all the time. I think there are times and places for things. And I think that people who are still developing and figuring out who they are an argument could be made that you should take time to figure out who you are in an ideal utopian world where you're not in an abusive situation that you need to escape from.
In an ideal utopian world, we don't live there, unfortunately. Sean Yardy said, "How would you recommend approaching children about substances that society says is bad?"
It's not going to be easy.
Unfortunately, I think there's another. You can't just address the substance. You have to address
what people will think about you when you talk about
how
it.
old is the children?
Mm-hmm.
How old is the kid?
Yeah.
If they're still believing in Santa Claus, then you can do whatever. You can tell them whatever you want. If they've gone post Santa Claus and they're discerning little children,
mm-hmm.
then you have to let them know that there's a propaganda campaign by the government, so that if you act in a certain way about these things, you'll have your freedom removed and you'll be thrown in jail.
And you can use kid words for that.
Yeah,
you know,
that will happen, and that's the deal. It doesn't mean that those things are bad in themselves. It's a nuanced conversation.
I just think if we hadn't invented the war on drugs, I just think of the children's books that would be out there. Like, I'm serious. Like, there are some really amazing. I follow a lot of trauma awareness and trauma recovery accounts on Instagram. And there are a lot of really great children's books with actually accurate and age-appropriate sex education information. Like, I remember a couple decades ago when the first Everybody Poops book came out.
Right.
It was
Shocking.
the first time you were ever talking about bodily functions in a kid's book.
Right.
And my mom could not handle it.
Sure.
It was so inappropriate. We had to be under parental supervision in that area of Barnes & Noble in case one of us was tempted to look at the Everybody Poops book.
She didn't want you to know that everybody pooped?
You already knew you pooped. You don't need to talk about it. It's private. You know? And now we have children's books that talk about, like, this is my vulva. You know, it's like a child's book about your body, so you can use accurate information about your body. And so if somebody in your family hurts you and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, what happened? You can say, this is what happened.
Right.
We could be having those sorts of books about things people put in their bodies.
Sean wants a link to this Everybody Poops book, I think.
I will. It's hard.
I think the easy thing, like when you say children, are you talking about 19?
5.
Like, there's adult things and then there's kid things.
How Ketamine Helps Mommy by Play School. There are adult things and there are child things, and it depends on the questions your child is asking. It depends on having a healthy relationship with your child so that when they have a question, they feel like they can ask you. People don't lie because they're liars. People lie because talking about the truth would get them punished. If you're in a healthy relationship with your child and your child feels like they can talk to you about anything, then you just need to be prepared to answer their questions when they come up with questions. If we're talking about like a 6-year-old who sees like commercials on television about drugs or a billboard about alcohol, or, you know, like, Daddy, what's ketamine? You know, because we've got billboards in Montana about ketamine now. And you can talk about the drug war. You can say, this is history now. I'm going to talk to you about U.S. history. 70 years ago.
It's right.
70 years ago, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the U.S. government said that certain things were unhealthy that aren't actually unhealthy. But just like you can drink too much coffee and feel sick, you can take too much of these medicines and also feel sick.
It's a good place to have a conversation with the children about fads.
Fads, peer pressure.
Blue no matter who is a fad.
Right.
Wearing a mask is a fad.
It's going to go away. It's going to stop being popular.
It's a fad. Suddenly it's become a cultural signal. It's become fashion. So there's a fad that comes through. Drugs, prohibition is a fad. The original alcohol prohibition was a fad. So you can talk about the fad of this thing being legal or not being legal, and how that's not necessarily the same as being good or not being good, or being useful or not being useful, or being dangerous or not being dangerous.
Right.
Illegal doesn't necessarily mean any of that. And so I don't know how far you want to go down the legal road talking to a child. But
if you're going to talk to your child honestly about what is actually healthy or unhealthy, or safe or unsafe, or consent or not consent, then you're going to have to talk about, there are rules in our world that don't have anything to do with healthy or unhealthy.
Right.
And you need to know, if you talk with somebody about one of these medicines, they're going to think you're being a bad person, because that's what the rules say. And so it's important to teach the knowledge and also to teach the social structures so that the child knows how. I mean, Sean's talking about, he's got a kid that's eventually going to be going into school.
Mm-hmm.
And, what if the kid goes to school and says, Daddy does things that the teacher says are bad things,
Mm-hmm.
Because medical cannabis.
So we had a friend in Portland. We went to visit a friend in Portland. 2 professional people, doctors, had a young child, 4?
Experts in Eastern medicine,
Yeah.
holistic wellness.
Young child, 4.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say 4. And they were still sneaking onto the back porch to smoke. Not because they just wanted to keep the smell and the actual smoke away from the child. It's that the mother was still hiding something that was completely legal.
Completely legal in that state and town.
From her own child.
Mm-hmm. Because even though her parents had done all those things.
Done all the things.
But when her parents did all those things, it was wrong.
It was illegal.
And so even though she is legally smoking marijuana, she went out on the porch and closed the curtain.
And had concerns about how she was ever going to deal with her child on the topic when society had already dealt with it.
Right.
It's already dealt with. It's not a problem.
Right.
If the kid goes to school in Portland and says, Mommy smokes marijuana.
No one's going to be like, eh. But unfortunately...
Stop trying to get attention.
Our friend that's asking about this idea for kids lives in a state where it is not legal.
It's not legal, right.
So even though, he only lives 3 hours away, we live in a state where a kid can go to school and say, Mommy smokes marijuana. And they're like, well, that's good because it's probably helping her with back pain.
Right.
Sean lives in a state where if the kid goes to school and says, Daddy smokes marijuana, they'll be like, should we call Child Protective Services?
Well, that's why you gotta be good to your kids so they don't rat you out.
But then you're teaching your kid to lie for you.
No. Lying by omission is its own thing.
We have a whole other show to get into.
Yeah.
Because I think this is an important topic. That was, part of why I kind of want to get into the practical steps towards decriminalization, because it has to include widespread education, widespread shifts in perspective, teaching people how to talk to their children about things that they were not talked to about accurately or healthfully. 710-805 said, Dare taught me what the drugs did, and it seriously just made me more interested in acquiring more details.
Yeah. Mine didn't. Mine was a horror story. It was dumb.
Montana Child Protective Services still has medical marijuana patients classified as criminals unfit for childcare. How messed up is that? In a state where it is medically legal for you to have medical marijuana for your back pain, you are still classified as a criminal unfit to have children by Child Protective. See, these are the sorts of things. We can't just legalize marijuana, but somebody might still lose their children because of marijuana.
That's true.
Everybody's got to get on board.
It's 6:03.
Oh, we have to stop. Sean just showed up at the last minute and started asking all these great questions.
Right.
We're going to have to do a whole other show, Sean, and talk about how to talk to your kid about acid and MDMA. Thank you so much to everybody that participated this afternoon. I know it's a controversial subject and not incredibly comfortable for people who have been brainwashed.
That's okay. Nobody was watching today, so we didn't offend hardly anyone.
Or maybe they just saw the title and were like, oh no, bad.
Drugs,
bad. Back away.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, we're just going to turn it off, y'all.
By the way, just brief note, we'll be doing this again next week, but hopefully again
in the
live
radio station
from the studios of KBMF downtown Uptown Butte.
So exciting.
Otherwise, thanks for participating in this event today, and we'll see you next week.